Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, we welcome to the show permaculture designer and theorist Dan Palmer. Dan is the host of the podcast Making Permaculture Stronger, where he facilitates fascinating discussions on what's right and what's wrong with permaculture and where it might be headed next. And the TLDR is that what's wrong with permaculture is, in the main, what's wrong with everything else. So we have a great discussion on the theory of design in general, the shortcomings of Western categorisations and their dualist implications, and somewhat improbably, we also talk about merging with a chicken. Quick note, I recorded this in a pub in regional South Australia, so there are a few audio wobbles I've done my best to clean up. Also, Dan was gracious enough to cruelly neglect his sick young children in order to make time to come on an obscure Chaos Magic podcast. So there are one or two jump cuts where I edited around his begrudgingly fulfilled parental duties. It's a truly fantastic chat, and all the good bits are definitely still in there, so onwards and enjoy. Dan Palmer, welcome aboard.
Pleasure to be here, Gordon.
All right, so I'm interested in the traditional first question because I can tell from your accent you are a Kiwi. So, Dan, were you a weird kid?
Slightly weird. Slightly weird.
In what sense? Did you collect bones or something?
I was quiet, introspective sort of a kid. I'd spend quite a lot of time just like watching a wasp's nest or something like that. I think the girls at my primary school probably thought I was a bit weird.
Just the girls? The boys thought you were normal?
No, actually, the boys and the girls.
And whereabouts in Kiwi land was this? I mean, you do get wasps all over. I lived in Auckland for, how long was that? Almost 7 years. Yeah, so I was just going to say, you get wasps everywhere, so I can't really tell where you are in New Zealand from wasps.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't help you much. I grew up in a beautiful lakeside village. It was called Lake Karaka, which means little bowl of sweetness, and that was just outside Rotorua in the Bay of Plenty.
Oh, very nice. Yes, I actually know it. There you go.
Oh,
cool. And so do you think, I mean, you mentioned the wasps kind of stuff, and were you a sort of odd naturalist kid, do you think, growing up? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, more so than friends. I'd go and wander around in the bush and just sort of peer and poke at things for long periods.
Yeah, usually what happens when I get guests on the show is that there does seem to be a foreshadowing of where they end up in their careers from childhood, which is, to be expected. But that's why I do it as a traditional first question, to see if there's any kind of little hints that maybe guests themselves haven't really considered about observation and trajectory and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, as you say that, a penny does drop. In terms of probably still coming across as weird to a lot of people and spending a lot of time sort of probing and poking around into things, trying to kind of figure stuff out.
Yeah, well, that's certainly what I pick up from your show, and will be the topic of the hour. But before we get there, tell us the journey of being this kid staring at wasps in the Bay of Plenty to being a sort of permaculture voice and consultant and designer in a whole other country. I mean, was that always the plan, or was there a sort of road to Damascus moment while you were out pursuing another career?
No, it was a sequence of reaching various forks in the path and making a call at the time, and sometimes tossing a coin as well. But what happened? I got to the end of high school, and at the end of high school, you've got to do something else. And I was like, geez, I'm going to have to do something else. What I'm going to do? And some friends were heading off to university. I had the idea of becoming a cat burglar, actually, and I even approached like steal from the rich and give to the poor or something like that. The details were vague, but I spoke to a locksmith even about an apprenticeship and whatnot. It turned out I was colorblind. I say that because I I'd also considered becoming an electrician for some reason. Then found out I was colourblind, which ruled that option out. And the cat burglar trajectory didn't hold up to much scrutiny either. So I ended up at university, went in for psychology, and it was the only thing that really tickled my fancy. And then after a couple of years, got into psychology and did a little bit of sociology, started getting into a bit of philosophy as well. And then one year led to the next, and I ended up finishing a PhD in the philosophy of psychology, looking into systems thinking at Monash University in Melbourne.
I was going to ask, was it like an Auckland Melbourne journey? Did you undergrad in Auckland?
No, I was at Waikato University in Hamilton. Yeah. Yep. So I ended up finishing this thing at Monash, and in my PhD I looked into, among other things, this plethora of false dualisms or splits or separations or dichotomies that underlied psychology and pretty much all the academic disciplines, as well as our civilization at large.
Well, that's a topic of some ongoing rumination amongst the premium members and on the podcast about the generally faulty theory of mind that, because funnily enough, when we get to the permaculture stuff, I see its impact there and it makes me pull my hair out. But yes. That's good to know. We can have that discussion. But carry on with the bio, Dan.
Yes, so I got to a point where I was on an academic track. I was doing some teaching work in the States during their summer, and but at some point I looked at academics that were 20 years down the path that I was on, and it occurred to me that their lifestyles had zero appeal to me. So I was like, oh, that's where I'm heading, and that's not where I want to end up. So I kind of freaked out and quit, got out of the academy, escaped, as it were, and I'd been spending hundreds of hours writing articles and stringing together long sentences composed of long words for, like 2 or 3 other academics in the world, obscure journals, obscure articles for obscure journals and stuff like that. And so as an antidote to that, I moved into a rental place with some folk that were growing vegetables and kind of started making sourdough bread and whatnot. And as part of that mix, I signed up for a permaculture design course, which someone suggested I might be interested in, thinking it was about gardening. That was in 2005, late 2005, with Bill Mollison and Jeff Lawton, and that fired me up. It seemed to me that a big part of where permaculture was coming from was this idea of let's unseparate or dissolve the separation between the stuff we know about the planet and ecology and where things are heading, and what we're doing. And so that commenced that journey, and stuck with that still going with it, I guess. What's that? However many years later?
13.
That is,
Happy
yeah.
13th.
13 years learning, and then eventually starting a business. And
going back to the growing of vegetables and the making of sourdough bread, was there in those first kind of couple of months the psychologist's awareness that this sort of mode of interacting with your, I guess, local environment has some fairly substantial, like, psychological uplift associated with it? I mean, did you bring that? Not only am I into this personally, but this is in many respects therapeutic. Was that there at the beginning?
I mean, the experience of it was the consciousness was more around. A big part of what I've been exploring on in the PhD was this pervasive dichotomy or split between organism and environment, or person and world, subject and object. It's got lots of different names, and
nature, culture.
Yes, yep. And the idea that when you look closely at these words, organism and environment, they imply each other, and it's completely meaningless to say that. I don't want to get too obscure here, but that the organism is a structure in space that stops at a skin, and then the environment starts. When you look closely, that's a very fuzzy boundary, and you can't define those two terms unless you look at it functionally. And anyway, the idea was, I realized that just as when a squirrel stores an acorn, it eats one acorn, stores it in its stomach, and assimilates its nutrients, it stores another acorn in a little nest in the tree or whatever. there's sort of this continuum. Like that's still part of the life process of the squirrel. So I had this feeling, kind of in the gardening sense, as we're growing vegetables and whatnot, of kind of merging with the space and this experience of kind of becoming just distributed into the garden. So it got to the point where it's kind of hard to say exactly where I stopped and the garden started. I mean, I also had this experience slightly before that where I took off to a shack in the woods with a solar panel and a chicken and a few other bits and pieces, and sat there finishing off the PhD. And I got to a point where it was hard to say where I stopped and the chicken started. We kind of merged into this chicken human kind of assemblage.
That's the weirdest thing, because I don't know if I mentioned when we were arranging this. I think I did, but I did my PDC with Jeff, or at least online, last year, and we bought 5 acres of the South Huon at the beginning of the year. So we're beginning the journey, scaling up from keen gardeners to I'm aware I know nothing, right? But it's just me down there at the moment on this little farm outside Geeveston, me and 5 chickens. And I've never had chickens before, and it's so weird that you say I have some kind of cabin fever is the wrong word, but there are some days where it gets very The Shining when it's me and these stupid birds, and it's fascinating that you say yes. I wasn't sure where the chicken ended and I began, because I've been there.
Yeah, it was something like this. It was down to 1 chicken and me, and at night time it would come in and I'd be reading a book on a seat in front of the potbelly stove, and it would hop up onto the arm of the chair and sort of stretch, and I'd stroke it, and as I moved around, it was always with me. If I was digging a hole, it was yes. Anyway, it was a thing. I think it got to a point where it was time to go back and spend time with humans.
Yeah, with humans, yes. Yes, I make sure I schedule time in Hobart or time in Melbourne, because they're not sufficient.
That's right.
They're not sufficient company. It's kind of coming back to that nature, culture, or organism green background divide. One of the things that we've been looking at that I think has permacultural implications, I suppose, is I don't know if you've read Flightways.
No, I haven't.
It's remarkable because it's basically asking, from a conservation perspective, if you take the last black rhino out of Africa and put it somewhere like Central Australia, all these plans to move some endangered animals out of Africa, put them in Australia, what exactly are you saving? If you take that out of context, like what is the rhino, and can you say you've saved it? And here's the other bit that this book gets quite good at, is you essentially are committing to an eternity of being a hybrid. So human plus critically endangered species that can only exist by your intervention means that it's not the animal anymore. You have become a hybrid. Because it doesn't exist. And it's that really, this is the kind of philosophical stuff I listen to and think about from a permaculture perspective. Because if the rhino is just its molecular constituents, so the molecules that make up a rhino, then kill it and pickle it and put it in the Natural History Museum. And you've saved the rhino. But then if you tell conservationists this, they'll be like, well, that's the opposite of what I want. And I'm like, guys, we need to drop down to the next level. We need to drop down to the next level and interrogate what theories of just ontologies that we bring to these very real challenges. And this is why I love your show so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's really rich, that example. Yeah, and this idea that organism and environment co-implicate or co-imply each other, and so you're dealing with a system. And the beauty of the black rhino and the kangaroo and whatever else is that adaptedness between its specific context and the particularities of its makeup and its behavior and everything else. And it's fascinating to me that this is one of the areas, because we'll move into the permaculture discussion, that I think is another missed trick, which is we are dealing with one way or the other. And we'll talk about assemblage as a shortcoming of thinking with design, but we are dealing with assemblages when it comes to arranging a permacultural system anyway. So the fact that we don't think sufficiently deeply about the rhino problem
but we appear to be interested in, and rightly so, we appear to be interested in environmental remediation and kind of, improving local biosphere by, in some sense, however problematic this is, right living. This is one of the pieces that I think why your show is so fascinating to me is that it's come at the right time. It typically always happens after the death of a founder, but like a movement needs to go through a dark night of the soul. So as we move into this discussion, tell the story about your gradual, because you liked permaculture when you found it, you did your PDC. When did it occur to you that parts of Denmark are a bit rotten?
Yeah. So it's been an interesting relationship. I liked it very much. I mean, I loved it. I was as can happen, particularly with the likes of Jeff Lawton and Bill Mollison, very compelling presenters. There's a bit of fervor, deep excitement. Oh my God, this is so relevant, and we need to go out and share this stuff. And then over the years, started to design professionally and practice it in a lot of different contexts. And slowly, this is a pattern for me, which I've repeated maybe 10, 20 times in my life, as I get into something, some approach. Often I've been lucky enough to learn directly from the founder or founders and read the core texts and all that, and then go and find mentors. And gradually over the years, I come into contact with the fact that no approach, no system is complete, is perfect, and start to bump up against some of the edges. And so in the context of working as a professional permaculture design consultant, I started to realize that cracks were appearing in my attempts to apply what I'd learned from my teachers and from the books. And initially I assumed it was because, I was missing something. I'd missed that memo, I hadn't read that page or whatever. But I did get to the point where I had to do something about these cracks that were opening. So I started to reach outside permaculture and bring in Band-Aids to try and patch them up effectively. It was only retrospectively that I realized that's what I was doing. And the Making Permaculture Stronger project was really about realizing, no, hang on a second, the thing's cracking. Let it crack. And in fact, get my fingers into the crack and actually open it up and see what's going on. And this idea that, to me, permaculture, you're talking about the dark night of the soul. To me, it is it's not necessarily a lot of awareness of it, but I do believe it is going through an existential crisis at the moment around this, its relationship to this thing called design, which on the one hand, it understands to be the core of what permaculture is as a design system, a design discipline. On the other hand, realizing that when we go into it, there's some issues there, some real confusions and so on.
This was one of the things that I really enjoyed. You said you've said it a bunch of times, but I heard it on the show, which is that it's a system of design without a theory of design.
Yes,
that's mental when you stop to think about it. Can you give it, just before we get to that, I'm interested in some of the Band-Aids that you attempted to apply in your own journey to realizing actually this is a systemic challenge that Band-Aids won't fix, so we need to get in there. Yeah. So what was some of the kind of halfway points that you tested before you landed on the fact that actually we all need to interrogate what even am design?
Yeah. Well, at least some of us would be good anyway. But one of them, probably the first one, was working with people and realizing that I get engaged by clients and I need to have some process to figure out what they're about, what they want to do with the place, and then support them on that journey as well as getting to know the place, which permaculture is relatively strong at. And I realized that there wasn't a lot there that really helped me get into any kind of depth about what the people I was encountering, what they were really about, and how did I help them? How do I help them explore what they really wanted? Because often there was something they really wanted that didn't come up with the approaches I was using, and that would bite the project in the bum later on. And so Alan Savory's holistic management approach had some kind of answers for me there. So I brought that in and did some writing and sharing around that, and that was appreciated by a large number of permaculturists who were recognizing that was a lacking piece. So just the ability to deeply engage with people and support them to tell you what they really want, which is not an easy thing. So that was probably the first Band-Aid. another one came through the work. My initial engagement with the work of the radicalist Christopher Alexander. A friend had a copy of one of his books, The Timeless Way of Building, on their bookshelf, and I had a bit of a look at that. Interesting kind of conversations I'm passionate to be having, and juxtaposed with it's needing attention.
Yeah, okay. That's the life. That's cool. We'll jump back in because I actually have a whole section on. Well, I have like Christopher Alexander as like a topic area, but before we get to there, what you were talking about in terms of bringing in sort of Alan Savory methods of essentially interrogating the client also strikes me as being quite psychological, because as in all things in life, your conscious motivations may not be the full motivations. On one level, it's lovely that you want to, improve your environmental footprint and grow your own food, but what are you really doing here? And if as a designer you don't get to the bottom of that, like designer as psychologist, you may not be solving what needs to be solved.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so much in that. Yeah, and this kind of naive understanding that, because people call you up and they say, we want permaculture, come and be our designer and give us permaculture. It's not, they don't want permaculture. They want what we all want, which is something around quality of life, and this is what Alan Savory brings. And they see some connection, or they perceive that permaculture or gardening or chickens or whatever has some contribution to make to what quality of life means for them. But quite often when you go into the things they're saying they want, you can help them realise are going to compromise quality of life. So honouring the fact that they are where they are, and the kids are at this age, and they have these physical limitations and capacities and all the rest of it, and going quite deep into that and realising that a lot of the right moves for them to make in their space can only come from that conversation, and that without support, it's very easy for that to be a superficial exercise. And part of the nature of those cracks was that, in my own experience, but also in the experience of others, seeing projects fail because of a lack of deep engagement with who the clients were, and just sort of treating clients or people you're working with as generic recipients of permaculture, where because you don't have the ability to help them articulate and what they're really after, you project yourself onto them. You say, well, I don't really know what you want, so I'll just tell you what I would do if it was my place, which of course is not a recipe for success.
And I'm really fascinated by that stuff, because I have clients in a different capacity to permaculture. But when you're talking about long-term planning, you have to begin with well, when do you plan to die? Serious question.
Yeah.
Because if you're dealing with, particularly in an Australian context, if you're dealing with tree changes, you're kind of dealing with boomers, and you got to look at how many decades they have of physical activity left. And I'm like, and at the age of 78, would you like to be using a compost toilet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Is that solving the right thing for you? And it's fascinating that I can kind of see your journey towards being this passionate, not defender, promoter of thinking better with design, because there is a kind of, if you approach clients with a psychological understanding that the design process makes them blank little cutouts, then you kind of go, well, what else is wrong with the design process? Which, of course, I guess brings us to Christopher Alexander, who has been a big influence on you. So tell us who he is and kind of what he's about.
Wow. So yeah, Christopher Alexander. Well, he initially studied mathematics, and then he got into architecture fairly early in his career. He was a practicing architect. He was a radical architectural theorist, and he got to the point where he's really a cosmologist as well. So as well as being an academic architect, teaching others, he wrote something like 30, a lot of books in his lifetime. And as I started to go deeper into some of these cracks, and simultaneously to go deeper into some of his work, I found this person who'd sort of reached a similar starting point 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and has just gone so far into this stuff and really deeply articulated some ways of approaching process and whatnot that I realised from early on and continue to realise have so much to offer to permaculture. So in some ways, you could say a lot of my work is simply about trying to make some of Alexander's insights and discoveries palatable or accessible to a permaculture audience.
I mean, and what do you think they are? And better question, what are the most challenging barriers you have encountered so far?
Probably the single most challenging, fascinating barrier I've found is this elusive quality in conversations around process. So whenever we do anything, whenever there's any kind of outcome, when anything happens, there's a process that led up to that. Wentworth Darcy Thompson, the biologist, hear this saying something like things are the way they are because they got to be that way, which is another way of saying the same thing. But when you try and kind of put the process we use, because each of us has a particular way of going about things, we have inbuilt kind of process understandings that we practice every time we do anything, and to invite people to put that into the foreground, to put it onto the table. I've realised that's an incredibly hard thing to do. It's almost like a blind spot situation. So often I'll, on the beginnings of a course or engaging with someone around this stuff, ask them some questions around their process, and it's almost like it's invisible to them, and they'll tell me about the specifics of a project with sort of zero or very, very little awareness of what the nature of the process they use is. And until that's the starting point, right? Because until you can actually put that on the table and have some sort of clarity about the way I go about doing things now, you can't move on to the next bit, which is like, okay, let's get better at that, and let's share the different ways we do that, and what's working and what's not, and so on. So I'd say that's probably the single largest barrier, the kind of entry barrier into the conversations that are fascinating me, and I've got a lot of energy for.
And this is theory of mind stuff, right? Because you're talking about one way or another a flow model. And we don't learn that. We have a kind of empiricist naturalist model, which is one of the shortcomings of, and I get why he did it, but it's one of the shortcomings of sort of how Bill assembled permaculture in the first place, which is that it is a bit too atomized, that we're used to, as you say, objects in space. And that's not necessarily the case at all, frankly. If you look at non-European cultures around the world, you do find flow models. You do actually find what we would call process. And so I really resonate with that, because the problem is not the problem. And the problem is not you in permaculture. The problem is you in the world. You have to kind of go with a flow model and see what unfolds as you approach a design opportunity or challenge. That's very fascinating, because that, weirdly, there's a bunch of other stuff, and I want to talk about what your definition of design is based on Alexander, and where permaculture needs to think about it. But there are so many other things that if we'd started with that, there's a bunch of other stuff in permaculture that would have unfolded differently, and I presume better. And I feel like the opportunity for that is coming up, or now.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, in a sense, several years back, I kind of got to a point where I said, well, maybe it's time for me to move on. If permaculture's center of gravity is over here, and kind of my passion and excitement is over there, and there's a bit of a gap between the two. If it's not looking like it's going to be closing, then I'm off. And in some senses, I construed to myself making permaculture stronger as a kind of a parting gift.
I love it.
But the response, not in terms of numbers, but in terms of really quality individuals within the permaculture movement, just showing us a huge amount of appreciation for the work, including, really importantly for me, David Holmgren, who's lives dead, as the surviving of the two co-originators. To have his excitement and engagement in the conversation has been enormous. So I feel kind of more committed to permaculture than I ever have been, and this feeling of its potential to loosen up and be on the move. That stuff you're saying about the flow philosophy and stuff, that was a big theme of my PhD work too. Was I got into these two philosophers, American philosophers, John Dewey and Arthur Bentley, and they talked about how we've imbibed the residue of Cartesian mechanistic thinking, where we tend to start with static objects and then join them all together and then hit play. And they call that an interactional approach, where inter means between. So you're looking at action between separate objects, as opposed to what they call a transactional approach, but which is something akin to the unconscious, or the understandings in indigenous and many other cultures and many other philosophies, including what people like Whitehead was doing, where processes.
I was just waiting to say Whitehead.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I like Dewey well enough, but it just seems to me that there's a sort of neo-emergentism which I think permaculture could really learn from. I don't know if you still keep your eye on that just dumpster fire that is modern philosophy, but the best part is there is a kind of neo-emergentism as a kind of like solve for the complete failure of materialism and the sort of long death of positivism, which some scientists still use, but philosophers haven't since the mid-20th century. But nevertheless, the people with their fingers on the missiles and the money are positivists for whatever reason. But I think this is the time is out. Funny enough, when you said making permaculture stronger might have been a parting gift, it strikes me that what you were doing is in fact meta-permacultural. Because if you look at how Bill and Dave actually put it together in the first place, what they did was looked outside themselves for particularly non-European modes of optimizing food production and say, okay, well, this is how you grow rice, and this is how you do this, and these sort of these plant assemblies grow well together. And yes, it's all a bit of a mishmash now, but what you're doing is the same, and what I hope to see more people doing is actually permaculture is that finding best practice, thinking with it, and seeing how that coheres towards a local environmental and food production optimization. I know that's a bit utilitarian, but you know what I mean. Like what you're doing, bringing in the likes of Christopher Alexander and other ways of thinking is permaculture. It is an optimization. In a way, Bill kind of said that. Like he says, you see old videos of him where he talks about, I hope after I'm gone, it looks nothing like what it does now, because that will mean I will have failed and it's ossified. And that's a kind of, that's a very Bill thing to say, because he did double down on some stuff that probably shouldn't have stayed around as long as it had. But other than that, like in theory, permaculture should be what it is you are doing.
Yeah, it's music to my ears to hear you picking up on that and saying that, because that's so much how I see it, and that's what excites me about where Bill and David, about where permaculture came from. Its genesis, this radical questioning, and to see it becoming something where some small group of people early on came up with some ideas, and our job is to regurgitate them indefinitely. That's flies in the whole face of this idea of permaculture as a radical revisiting of the basic questions about what a healthy humanity with a future looks like. So sometimes I sort of laugh, because sometimes, of course, as you'd expect, this is not an unhealthy thing. It would be unhealthy if permaculture didn't have an immune system, but sometimes there can be an initial reaction of, hang on, you're criticising some of the stuff Bill Mollison said. How's that?
What do you mean I shouldn't build a herb spiral?
Yeah, that's right. How's that healthy? I'm saying, that he was a radical critic. What I'm trying to do is kind of channel my respect and admiration for what he did by doing more of what he did, rather than just saying the same thing he said over and over again.
Do as I do, not as I say. It's in the book.
There you go. Yeah, no, I laugh because I know it's not going to be that. At some point, I'll probably write about it. I don't feel like it's going to be that hard of a point to get across.
Well, so I've sort of see if you like this because you kind of hinted at something which I've observed just generally being on the internet and so on, and also operating in this space. And when I write about it, you kind of get the backseat permy talk. And it occurs to me in a kind of cynical and sort of and darkly funny way. You can put permaculture people into zones. So you kind of have like at the edge, you got a zone 4, which is the sort of interested outsiders and YouTube commenters. And you kind of move further in zone 3, probably people who've got some kind of qualification, short course up to PDC, aren't necessarily... And probably aren't necessarily on property, and that's not dismissive because I'm hugely interested in market gardens and urban farming and so on. And then you kind of move to zone 2, and I'm getting somewhere with this, which is probably full-time designers and professional market gardeners, people quietly getting on with their own permy system, I'd put in 2, and maybe some prominent homesteaders that you see on the internet and so on. And then zone 1 is the Salatons and Holmgrens and Savories and Dohertys and whatever. And it just seems that I think the discussion you want is somewhere in between zone 2 and zone 3, because zone 1... And I'm glad, and I've listened to David on your show, and I've listened to him, talk about and approve of your work and say really nice things. But it seems like the tension point is between the people who are in the trenches of doing, rather than... Because if you think about the people in my hypothetical zone 1, they've made permaculture 1.0 work for them. Mm-hmm. So they're potentially less interested in kind of really interrogating the foundations and having it unfold. But it's what makes it, I think, so challenging doing the kind of stuff you're doing or trying to trigger the conversations, that the overwhelming majority of people are in zone 4. And so you'll have a kind of echo chamber of put in a swale, build a herb spiral, put in a pizza oven, permaculture done. And it's weird, and it's me saying don't lose hope, because I think in that sort of zone 2-3 tension is where some really meaty discussions, certainly the kind of ones you have on your show, can happen and can make change.
Yeah, no, totally. And I've been deeply delighted with the tone, the civil intelligence and discussion, so without exception. On the Making Permaculture blog. So maybe Zone 4 hasn't heard about it yet, or whatever the reason is. That's been great. And I'm also so encouraged by the fact that people in Zone 1 in your breakdown there, like David Holmgren and Darren Doherty and others, are supportive of this stuff. To me, if that wasn't happening, I'd be concerned. But I'm deeply excited just to see where it all evolves. And I'm conscious too that like part of what I want to do is decentralize the conversation, so it's not it's not like a certain small group of people comes up with ideas and everybody else, like 99% of the movement or whatever it is, their job is to consume, to receive that stuff, to decentralize that. Hey, no, we're all human beings, we're all qualified to be human beings, we're all in process. Let's all talk and explore and develop things. But on the other hand, it's not everyone's cup of tea. This kind of work and this kind of inquiry for a bunch of reasons, but I'd like to think there is enough people engaging in it such that the results of these kind of conversations can then be made as an offering. Hey, look, here's some different ways of trying things. Maybe give them a try. Just reach your own conclusions. There's all these different niches, all these different kinds of work that need to be done, and of course. I've always got such huge respect for the people out there doing the market gardening and making it work, and and doing the hard yards on the ground, which of course without which permaculture crumbles.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way of thinking about it, because as you say, not everyone's interested in diving into Whitehead and emergentism and interrogating empiricism and. Like I am, that's my jam, and we'll get there. And it does need to be an offering at the end. It's like, okay, well, see how this works, and in particular, start with a flow model outside of it, and here's my question for you, which you are allowed to have only a provisional answer for, which is, to be expected. What is design, and what would you like to see happen other than that first step one? Like, what would you like? What is your best case? And this is why it's provisional, and also you can't. Context will change, but what is your definition of design, and how would you like? What does today / this morning an optimized design, quote unquote, process look like for you for permaculture?
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll start by talking about my current way of kind of telling myself what I mean when I'm talking about permaculture design. I mean, there's been a bit of angst and controversy in my circles around this word design. We might come back to, but what I'm talking about is this is really bringing in Alexander's influence, is the process of consciously immersing in and working with the whole situation to transform it in healthy directions, to transform it toward life and beauty and so on. Just about to release a blog post where I explore this idea of generative transformation, where all the inquiries on the blog have sort of injected a certain amount of meaning into those two words, but where the point is we're hands-on, we're using everything we've got, we're involved in a situation, and we're transforming it towards good stuff, towards health, towards abundance, etc. That when we talk about design process, that's the point of it. Whereas the word design, as it's defined in dictionaries and so on, is problematic because it separates itself from the actual doing, where design becomes this exercise in premeditation and prefabricating or prematurely dreaming up a whole lot of ideas and decisions, and then we impose that on reality. So I have been exploring this tack of saying, no, I want to hold on to the word design and see if we can loosen it up and kind of reinfuse it or sort of dissolve it back into the actual process of doing stuff on the ground. Because sometimes the reactions are, what's this obsession with permaculture design? I'm not interested in design. I'm interested in actual farming or actual this or that. Where it's kind of like, well, that's the point, is the processes that are happening in all of these contexts. But sometimes I do wonder about dropping the word design, and there's an interesting character who's just popped up on the blog with some brilliant insight and comments and whatnot. He's working on an upcoming blog series of posts where he's looking at this idea that maybe the future of permaculture would be a better future if it shed the word design, which is quite a radical kind of proposal.
Well, I'm going to ask two questions there, because much like, and there's some backstory in how the history of kind of European or Western magic over the last 150 years more or less exactly matches, because it's just a group, same things going on in permaculture. But I would prefer to keep the word design and frankly have it sort of Alexandrian transformed. Mm-hmm. Because sort of what you're talking about there, it's almost like a late Heideggerian turn. So it's not that I'm calling you a Nazi, but like it's that, or even I don't know how much you know about, say, the corpus hermeticum or general hermetic knowledge, but broadly speaking, the philosophy or cosmology behind it is that the human as a model of, or a microcosm of the macrocosm, completes creation. So it's that you and place completing creation. And it just seems like there are ways that we used to think with these challenges that at least need to be slid underneath what it is we do just to see what happens, right?
Totally.
So, okay, I'm pro keeping the word design, but as you say, if you've been idly thinking about, well, what word would I use to replace it? Even just as a thought exercise, Dan, what would you replace the word, what would you change your business card to?
This word transformation is something that has been resonating with me, although I'm very conscious that it's a kind of a not a commonly used word. But the idea of consciously actually working with landscapes, people, whatever, to transform them in particular directions.
So like permaculture transformer, land transformer, or just transformer, so that people expect you to turn into a VW.
Yeah, that's right. I hadn't made that connection.
This is interesting because
because if I'm in discussions with someone, like what I'm interested in doing is working with situations to transform them in certain directions, to actually start making moves on a landscape or in a relationship or whatever it is, and supporting the evolution of the whole thing. That's what excites me.
And I think absolutely that's where it's going. If you look at how, I get why he did it, but if you look at Bill's more or less rigorous sticking to an empiricist naturalist way of thinking with the environment, again, problematic term, that he's looking to make changes to. There is that separation, like I heard you bitch about it, I loved this, I clapped along, this notion of observation, like, you get on your property, spend 1 year observing. It's like, what is happening there? Do you think, when it comes to transformation, like I could see your process, hang on, where was I going with this? This is where we incorporate the quote-unquote human into the rest of it, which is almost where your journey began in terms of transforming transformation. Because we don't even think not just about a client, but the best things you'll hear in the Permaculture Designer's Manual is that you are the apex predator on your land. Which is true in a way, but it doesn't have that same transformation. Transformation is holistic in the sense that it is the transformation of your human lives and how they express in local space and so on. And I feel like that's probably, am I getting it right? Is that where you would like it to go?
Yeah. That's resonating. I mean, there's a whole thing around this idea of what the word whole and the word part and holism and all that. But yeah, totally. Yeah, transforming the whole system, which where a big part of it is realizing that the humans and the place are the idea is for them to be kind of non-separate expressions of the of the way this thing is unfolding.
So this is a fun bit. We could just bitch now. This is the fun bit. Other than these kind of foundational, I guess, philosophical or even cosmological challenges or work that needs to be done, what else is wrong with permaculture or that needs to be interrogated? I thought of two immediately. I thought its declinism annoys me, and I would also like to see better tactics in terms of engaging with local economies. I'd want us to be better at money and local government interaction, and I kind of think those two go hand in hand. It emerged from that kind of Club of Rome declinism, which was really fun to see David in the end of Retro Suburbia go, I may have been a few decades too early with this, but nevertheless,
that's right. Yeah.
Nevertheless, I still had a fucking great life running it this way, and those are the two things. Because I think a flow model, a transformation model, if you will, is almost by definition utopian. I would like it to be utopian and towards kind of like an up rather than down direction. One of the examples I gave, and it's how David describes the cool cupboard in Retro Suburbia as a low energy solution, because obviously it is, like you're cooling a pantry with air that's cooled by the earth and comes up from the ground, right? That's a free energy solution. That's not a low energy solution. That's like a flying saucer. Let's start thinking about this in a utopian way rather than a declinist, because I think that's the bit of the transformation that I think would see a lot of permaculture farms bloom if they started to think up rather than down, regardless of what happens.
Yep. Yeah, that resonates.
So what else annoys you about it? This is the fun bit.
Well, I mean, to sort of take a meditate, there's a wonderful young colleague of mine, Dave Hursthouse, published several posts back where he compiled a list of weak links or things that are wrong, or where there's opportunities for improvement in permaculture, and I'm just sort of entering the home straight with from my own perspective with the blog, which I kind of now see it's transformed itself from a parting gift into a kind of a line of pebbles through the forest that are pointing to really diving into some of the spaces Alexander points us towards, but moving away from the way that making permaculture stronger was originally construed. Was the way to make it permaculture is to make it stronger is to compile problems, find the biggest, baddest problem, and then try and make that problem go away. And once we've sorted that out, move to the next one, and so on. What I realized was that approach itself is flawed in the sense, well, for a number of reasons. One is you get through all the problems 20, 30, 50. I mean, the more you look, the more that pop up. By the time you sorted out the last one, the first one's popped up again. So you're like the person that mows the school lawns. Once you've finished mowing, you just go back and start again. And the energy of it all is about less of things. Let's make the problems go away, as opposed to where I'm heading with it, which is rather than strengthening the weaknesses or making the weaknesses go away, let's focus on permaculture expressing its potential, where a lot of that discussion just becomes redundant. And so what I'm interested in doing is saying let's kind of cut, just start pruning permaculture. Imagine if it's like a tree. Let's just start pruning stuff away and remove the dead wood, the diseased wood, the stuff that's not working, and go back to what's great about it, what's pure and beautiful, and that stuff that excites people deeply when they first engage with it or do a workshop on it. And then let's work from there to move toward more of something rather than less of something, towards deep understandings of process and all the rest that are about supporting permaculture to express its potential. So I'm not the conversation around bitching or going through the problems is just feeling a bit
done.
Not my cup of tea anymore.
So if we do a hard pruning of this tree, I mean, what is that core that is its beautiful part? Is it actually that, and has it always been transformation and it's just taken you to work it out? I mean, because if you look at how it has that, it turns a friendly face to best practice lifeways around the world and tries to put them together. Like, is its core that motivation rather than its expression in swales and tagasasti and all those kind of like bits that fell out of that journey? Is that the trunk of the hard pruned tree?
I'll share how I'm thinking about it at the moment, but yeah, that's remarkable. Yeah, really on the same page there. So the way I'm thinking about it, I'm working with an illustrator at the moment. We're turning the blog post central illustration will be around a tree, where at the high level you've got three distinctions. So the canopy, or the leaves, the canopy, all the major limbs, smaller branches, the leaves, they represent site-specific solutions, so including swales and herb spirals, etc. And then the roots represent the general universally applicable foundational layer. So that includes foundational assumptions around energy futures and whatnot, pattern awareness, ecological literacy. It also includes principles, ethics. The idea is that no matter where you're doing permaculture, these things are relevant, they apply. And then the neglected bit, which is the trunk, is the process that we use to get from the general universally applicable stuff to the site-specific solutions that are appropriate for these people in this place at this time. And what I'm looking at doing is I mean, this is kind of giving you a heads up on where it's going. Well, hopefully there'll be a bit of excitement and controversy. We'll see what happens. But it's basically coppicing the tree, so cutting it down, realizing that what happened was that coming out of those beautiful foundations and just the deep insights around kind of humans having their cake and eating it too, in the sense of providing for our needs locally in a way that enhances the systems we're part of rather than detracts from them. That what happened somehow along the way is that rather than doing what you were just saying, which I think is really right on, and it's what anyone that sticks with the stuff figures out themselves, that it's really about this ongoing dance, the participation, the transformation. But what happened was that I think Bill Mollison, to some extent, and others, they reached outside permaculture and brought in scion wood or wood, which
I like it.
They grafted onto this beautiful rootstock, and it kind of grew, but it never really worked. And my kind of idea is, like, if we focus in on that graft, we realize it's still sick and weeping and diseased today. And what I'm suggesting is let's coppice the tree, so cut it off below that faulty graft, and let fresh understandings, fresh material, much of which is already there to be drawn on. Let that sprout up, and let there be many sprouts, many explorations of a process that's worthy of permaculture and supports it to express itself. And of course, in the act of chopping the tree down, all the herb spirals and swales and the strategies and everything else, they'll all fall to the ground as they're available to refertilize and be part of the kind of the next chapter. It's not like they're being brawled out, but the idea is
chop and drop.
Yeah, exactly. That we're performing a chop and drop on permaculture itself.
I love it. I think that's because there again, and it's the swale is the kind of classical example, and pretty much has been for 20 years of, like, do I need swales? It's like, well, it depends, and it'll be really good to see that, yes, be processed through the soil and see what it does when it grows up through this new foundational root understanding of better ways of thinking with what permaculture even am. I really like that idea because it also has a nice resonance back to, Bill and David's original kind of like tree model of how it works. So that's
totally. Yeah.
This is when we're going back to, like, the zone 3, zone 4 people, they'll get that. That's a remarkable way of conveying the mission, I suppose.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'm working with this wonderful illustrator. We just had a meeting yesterday. So, couldn't end up being a poster or something that, as well as the book, we'd like to actually make it to the point where people would voluntarily say, hey, this is helpful in conveying what permaculture is, because it gives a place for all the different bits and pieces and helps get across, like, at the high level, that there's that ratio on a permaculture design course or in a book or whatever, or in you doing your thing on your 5 acres, there's a ratio between the foundational stuff, the process stuff, and whatever the specific patterns, strategies, and techniques are that emerge there. And even a little bit more literacy around that is important, because often on a permaculture design course, it's pretty much all swales and herb spirals, all the equivalent. It's all strategies and techniques, and a little bit of the general stuff, and almost nothing about process. Whereas, if it's a design process, permaculture design process course, then lifting that ratio, lifting the amount of time that's spent on process and collaborating together to generate some kind of worthy content there, which one way or another has to be around transformation and where Alexander has so much to offer us.
Yeah. Last question, and it's a big one. So I've mentioned the kind of empiricist naturalist approach that has previously informed it, and you just talked about the flow model. Now, I'm very interested in anthropology. I get anthropologists on the show a lot who are in this kind of, there's a invisible college of anthropologists kind of at the moment, looking at the fact that as you go out and engage with and interact with non-European cultures, particularly when it comes to things like spirits and magic and so on, there are realities to these phenomena that we can't adequately think with, and we've previously done things like bracketed them and all this, and it's still, it makes it inert as it brings it into a Cartesian dead machine universe. So there's some really exciting work that's being done there. And some of my previous guests, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Dean Radin, probably the world's leading parapsychologist, or Lynn McTaggart, and they have, oceans of research to do with the impact of human intentionality on different growth rates of plants and the nutritional content of food and all this, to the point where the science is in. Like, if you're interested, Dr. Radin's book, Real Magic, has probably the best summation of it. And you think this is of critical importance, and it then overlaps somewhere between the psychological, putting speech marks or bracketing that, the sort of psychological treatment of the client, and this sort of root-stop change about fundamentally interrogating the cosmology that permaculture grows out of, because the results are too important and dramatic to not be incorporated in there somewhere. And I'm just wondering, one, if you've thought about this at all, or as a best guess, hypothetically, where something like that would appear on the tree.
Yeah, fascinating question. I'm interested in all those. Things. I mean, the whole process of the tree and the re-sprouting. One of the things I'm exploring with a bunch of friends that's really the defining passion of my work is we're calling it living design process, and that's kind of, once this work has been done of pulling off the chop and drop. That's the name of one of the shoots we're exploring together, where that's really engaging deeply with Alexander's work. And part of that is realizing that our generic default empiricist mechanistic design process understandings have deprioritized the realms of intuition, of feeling, and delegated or relegated or sidelined those to the artists or all the nutbags into para stuff and so on. So part of that exploration is really kind of opening the space up and kind of letting it all in. Honoring it all, honoring all the. So
Dr. Jack Hunter, who's one of the anthropologists I mentioned, calls it ontological flooding, and he needs the academy to be ontologically flooded, and I think that can be said of these particular challenges as well. Because Bill, and I get it, especially if you look at how permaculture developed from the 70s and in its early days of putting ads in magazines that are kind of hippie adjacent, I get why he kind of rigorously closed that stuff down and focused on empiricism. But here's the infinite loop. Empirically, non-empirical methods must be involved because they work better to the point of being miraculous when you are in context. And it comes back to the role of the human in system, because on my 5 acres, I am the kind of chief source of whatever intentionality is that can make things grow faster. And outside of Western lifeways, there's entire epistemologies of, this is the kind of, don't use the word para, of engaging with the interiority of plant life and animal life that is basically everywhere outside of this European mode of thinking, which has been banished and I think needs to be flooded back in, because there's clearly something to it. I don't know what it is, but here are the data,
And another related aspect to all this is what Christopher Alexander did or attempted to do in volume 4 of his 4-volume 2,000-page masterwork, The Nature of Order, which he called The Luminous Ground. But that one thing he said is, look, you can take on board all the stuff I've said around patterns and around healthy process and getting away from the poverty of the type of empiricism we've prioritized and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, until we do some work around transforming at the cosmological or worldview level, then we'll fall back into the old rut. And part of what he was exploring is an entirely different conception of space and time, what the building blocks of the universe are, or what the universe is made of. And he came up with this idea of centers, which are defined recursively, but within that, he was at pains to try and develop a cosmology where intention or life, vibrance, and so on, they're not like these optional extras that when you get a certain connection of atoms harmonizing the right way, then consciousness pops up or whatever else. So, yeah,
I'm very optimistic about this process, because I think if we do it, well, not even right, if we just give it our best, there's some really fascinating stuff that can and needs to be done. So I'm glad making permaculture stronger isn't a parting gift, Dan. I think you've got some fun years ahead.
Yeah, well, it should be careful what it wishes for, because it's the respect and love and support and endorsement and so on I've received from my permaculture colleagues has been overwhelming, and I kind of feel like, okay, well, if that's your attitude, then you're going to put up with me for a lot longer. and we're just getting started here.
Nice. Well, on that, we're actually just finishing up, Mr. Palmer. So for people who would like to know more about the show and your kind of stuff, like what do they do? Where do they go? Lay it on them.
Well, so we've been talking a lot about the Making Permaculture Stronger blog, which is makingpermaculturestronger.net. Just at the end there, I alluded to this living design process stuff, which is we're starting to get some content up at livingdesignprocess.org. Those are probably the two links most relevant to today's conversation.
Nice one. Well, I had a great time. It's always fun to talk to people whose shows you listen to, because you have like pent-up observations that you want to inflict upon them. So thank you for being patient with me, Dan. It's been a great chat, and I love the show.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great to get to know you a little bit, and I appreciated some of those pent-up observations and some of the connections you made personally, different aspects of life and all that. So thank you.
So good to finally meet another were chicken. I'm also really happy, other than that the conversation extended sort of out and under permaculture, where it can find universal application in your own life, given, design or process thinking applies outside of making a garden. Having said all that, paraphrasing something Bill Mollison once observed, he said, "I can teach anyone to garden, and once you've got a gardener, you've got a philosopher." There is something about close contact with non-human living systems that invites philosophy and metaphysics. Of course, for this audience, I'm preaching to the choir, but it's still sometimes useful to be reminded. So if you want to know more, check out the show notes for links to the sites Dan mentioned, or check out some episodes of his podcast. Speaking of podcasts, subscribe to this one in your favorite podcatcher on Spotify or on YouTube. Find us at runesoup.com or the Runesoup Facebook page, and find me retweeting miscellaneous nonsense on Twitter, where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.